Just a warning, this week's episode deals with death and graphic descriptions. Listener discretion is advised. Most UFO encounters end in fascination and awe-inspiring quests to find answers. And some encounters even end hopeful, but not all of them. And sometimes, in the worst of cases, they've actually ended in death. These are the close encounters of the deadly kind.
You are now somewhere in the skies with your host, Ryan Sprague.
Crash course before we get super dark. The J. Allen Hynek Close Encounters Classification System. A close encounter of the first kind is a visual sighting. A close encounter of the second kind is where there is some kind of interference, perhaps electrical, or there is damage to vegetation or the ground where an event took place. A close encounter of the third kind is where an actual pilot or animated creature is seen during a UFO sighting. A close encounter of the fourth kind is where a person is abducted by a UFO. A close encounter of the fifth kind is one where communication takes place between humans and extraterrestrial intelligence, such as telepathy. And a close encounter of the sixth kind is where a death of a human or an animal has resulted during or because of a UFO event. And it's at this close encounter of the sixth kind that we begin our dark journey. On the evening of October 21st, 1978, 20-year-old Frederick Valentich set out in his Cessna 182L aircraft from Moorabbin Airport in Victoria, Australia, on a routine training flight. Valentich, who had only had his pilot's license for a little over a year, had roughly 150 hours of flying time to his credit, but he was qualified to fly both day and night. He left the runway at just short of 6:20 p.m. A little over 45 minutes into the rather non-eventful flight, everything changed in an instant. At 7:06 p.m., at an altitude of around 4,500 feet, Valentich would radio the control tower in Melbourne, asking if there were any other aircraft in his airspace. After the control tower replied that it had no traffic, Valentich would report that he could clearly see an unidentified aircraft approaching him. He would further describe that it appeared to have 4 bright landing lights. Valentich would continue that the aircraft had passed over the top of him at high speed, so fast that he couldn't focus on the details of its shape. After several moments, according to the tapes of the transmissions, Valentich and the flight tower would have the following conversation.
The aircraft has just passed over me at least 1,000 feet above. Is there any Air Force aircraft in the vicinity?
No known aircraft in the vicinity.
Seems to be playing some sort of game. He's flying over me.
Can you describe the aircraft?
As it's flying past, it's a long shape. Cannot identify it. It has such speed. It's before me right now, Melbourne.
How large would the object be?
Seems like it's stationary. What it's doing right now is orbiting. The thing is just orbiting on top of me. It's also got a green light and a sort of metallic, like it's shiny on the outside. That strange aircraft hovering on top of me again. It's hovering and it's not an aircraft.
Around 30 seconds later, after the strange metallic scraping sounds, the transmission ended. Shortly after, an extensive search would get underway, The search would last 4 days and would involve RAAF and civilian aircraft. In total, over 1,000 square miles were searched, but no sign of the wreckage or of Valentich was ever found. Even the radio survival beacon that was on board the plane failed to identify its location. However, further investigations into the incident would leave people divided as to what had happened. Did Valentich have the misfortune to run into a UFO up there? Or did he simply become disoriented due to his inexperience at flying? According to UFO researcher and author Timothy Good, those taking part in the search were asked by the military to report any incidents of UFOs or strange lights to them only, and not to speak publicly of any potential sightings. What's more, any planes who were airborne at the time were told to keep any communications they might have heard on the frequency wave confidential. Whether these orders, if indeed they were issued, were done so in the knowledge of UFO activity in the region or not, or whether it was simply an order given to prevent panic or sensationalizing of the incident, remains unknown. There were several tentative sightings of possible evidence when it came to Valentich's aircraft. One of an oil slick, and one of apparent wreckage in the water, but neither could be sufficiently traced to his Cessna, with the wreckage itself also never being confirmed. The eventual findings of an official investigation report released in 1982 would state that the reason for the disappearance of the aircraft had not been determined. The report did, however, make the presumption that the result was indeed fatal to Valentich. Despite the mystery behind it all, perhaps the most convincing evidence that something very much untoward did indeed take place are the words of Steve Roby, the person on the radio control in Melbourne.
The aircraft was orbiting above him, and on several occasions he sort of stated that towards the end it wasn't an aircraft, and he described it as having a sort of a green light on it, and also it appeared to be a sort of a silver metallic colour. And he described it as being of a long shape, and as I said before, a silver colour with the various lights on it. And he actually did say it wasn't an aircraft. So finally, we lost contact with him in a very strange way. The communications he was putting out seemed to break. People describe it as a sort of a metallic sound, the last transmission that was sent from Delta Sierra Juliet.
He would state that he didn't for 1 minute believe that Valentich was attempting to carry out a hoaxed incident of any kind. Roby would elaborate that in the final moments, he could hear that Valentich was definitely concerned for his safety. He would further describe his communications as rushed, and as if Valentich was very startled. In light of the report, there was an abundance of theories and claims as to what might have happened to Valentich. Some claimed that it was likely that Valentich had become disoriented, possibly due to the reflection of the setting sun off the water shining back at him. Further suggestions asserted that due to this disorientation, he very well could have ended up flying upside down, perhaps even mistaking the lights from his own aircraft, reflecting off the water in the seconds before crashing into the water itself. There have also been suggestions that the, quote, long shape that Valentich reported was actually his perception of the planets Venus, Mars, and Mercury, as well as the star Antares, which was allegedly very bright at the time. However, while these suggestions are certainly possible, surely such a scenario would have led to a discovery of wreckage in the vicinity. After all, a search mission was in place almost immediately. And then there's the alien explanation, with many believing that Valentich may have actually been abducted by aliens in mid-air. There were also several residents who would inform UFO researcher Paul Norman a little over a decade after the incident, that they had in fact witnessed an unusual green light flying just above an aircraft on the night in question.
Well, the most interesting one of the lot is this farmer, that he was baling hay, and he said the bearing in the baler started to scream and make a noise, and he'd been having trouble with it, and he thought, oh no, not this again. So he stopped, dismounted from the tractor and turned round, and the baler had stopped and the noise was still going. And he said, I was trying to come to grips with this for a minute, and he said, then I became aware of a shadow and looked up, and he said, I was under a big saucer, he called it, and he said, going from the length of the bale and the tractor would have been 90 feet in diameter. And it was kind of, and as he's flown in aircraft and he gets his crops done, he knows when an aircraft's about to stall, and he thought, shit, this thing's going to drop on me. And he ran out the side of the paddock, out from underneath it, looking up, and he said, looking up under it, it kind of came in and went up, just dark, you couldn't see anything. But the most remarkable part was, you know, on merry-go-rounds at shows, they have the horses, and they have, it's that wide, they've got these little wooden lats. Have you noticed them? They're nailed to it so you don't slip over.
Oh, yeah.
They're about an inch and a half by half an inch. And then there's a gap, and there's another one. They're all around the edge. Well, he said that's what it looked like underneath, but there were two rows of them. With your blink, you could see one row, which was rotating very fast, but the other one wasn't. And it was rotating in the opposite direction, but very slow. You could see it quite plainly. And he said as it moved slowly along, it kind of came up like that, but there was a piece sticking up out of the top, like a dome, and around the bottom of the dome appeared to be a black seal of some kind. That's what he took it to be, like a weather sword or something. And he said the dome had it like a church door in it with an arched top, but no windows that he could see, and no handle on the door or anything. And he said on what he took to be the rear of it, there was slight protrusions that he would call rudders, and two big round holes, and he said there was shimmering heat coming out of one, and the other one, there were little spurts of flame coming out of it, and he gained the impression that one engine wasn't working, you know, because one disc wasn't spinning, and then, as he cleared it, he said the most remarkable thing of all, there was a Cessna aeroplane stuck to the side of it.
The whole aeroplane?
The whole aeroplane, yeah. He said the aeroplane, the tops of the wings were flat against the side of it, and the tail was kind of hanging down, a bit clear of the edge. And he said there were no chains or ropes or anything like that visible. And I think he said there was some oil running down the side of the Cessna, and he thought this may have been ingested if there was an air intake underneath or something, because heat and flame coming out would suggest air burning, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Or something like that.
Combustion
And anyhow, he scratched the registration number on the tractor with a nail, and he said, next time I come up, I'll give you the number. And he did. It's written down at the shop in the book. And the interesting thing is, it was the day following when that plane went missing between Victoria and Tasmania. You know, when that one, he rang up and said there were lights around him and all kinds of things. Yeah. And it was the day following it.
And if alien abduction wasn't elaborate enough, there were other theories. For example, some researchers and investigators assert that Valentich had orchestrated the entire affair in order to disappear and then begin a new secret life. Some were suspicious of Valentich, seeing as he had allegedly given two different reasons for being in the air that evening, telling flight officials that he was traveling to King Island to pick up some friends, while apparently telling others that he was making the journey to pick up crayfish. Furthermore, it would later come to light that he had not correctly informed King Island Airport of his intention to land there. In truth, despite apparent, once again, unverifiable sightings of Valentich in the area over the coming years, it is highly unlikely that Valentich did fake the incident. It is perhaps also interesting that the incident took place over the Bass Strait, a stretch of water that has a long history of strange disappearances, bizarre lights, and UFO sightings. Might Valentich not have been a victim of alien abduction, but something more akin with the unknown fate that meets those who are lost in such mysterious locations as the Bass Strait, perhaps even being compared to something like the Bermuda Triangle? No matter what happened to Valentich, it is both a mystery, but even more importantly, a tragedy. If we are to believe that he crashed somewhere out there in the water, this means that a pilot lost his life. He was a human being. And to further emphasize this, I want to personally share a clip from the second ever episode of the Somewhere in the Skies podcast, where we interviewed longtime listener favorite Micah Hanks, who was actually separated by Frederick Valentich by one person. And that was the girlfriend of Valentich at the time of the incident. Perhaps this conversation with Micah Hanks can add one more piece to the puzzle. Have a listen.
Yeah, I'd always been fascinated with that case, Ryan. And at one point, one of my listeners in Australia wrote to me and said, "Hey, Micah, I've got a friend who was Freddie's girlfriend when he went missing. I think that you two should catch up and talk."
Wow.
And, at first it didn't even dawn on me what this person was saying, because they said, Freddie's girlfriend? Who's Freddie? Where'd he go? And I remember reading that email and going to sleep, and then getting up the next morning and going back and rereading the email, and I'm like, oh, Frederick Valentich. So he says, yeah, Rhonda is a good friend. She works here with me, and, she said that she would be happy to talk to you. So we arranged for a Skype, and brandy glass in hand, and here in my bunker, it was, late at night on my end, and then, of course, early morning in Australia, where she and her husband Joe were. And they were sitting there drinking coffee, and, you can see the trees and stuff and the sunshine in the background. It was really sweet. We had this great conversation, and I talked with Rhonda about just all sorts of different things in relation to this case. She has kept every newspaper clipping. She has, scrapbooks full of stuff about this case. Not only for her emotional attachment to it, but it's fascinating because Rhonda, like so many, she had this personal experience. She may not have seen a UFO, but she knows the story, and she was, of course, she called it an interrogation, but she was interviewed by the air authority there in Australia because they were trying to find out if anybody knew anything about Valentich, and they had to look at all possibilities, and they couldn't rule out the possibility that maybe he had planned his disappearance or something like that. And I have heard those anecdotal reports of people. There was one in which a person claimed that they were in, I think it was the Bahamas, but they met a guy who claimed he was Frederick Valentich. There's very little in the way of substance, let alone validity, I think, to those stories, but they do come up from time to time. Rhonda, on the other hand, she has no idea what happened to him, but she certainly took an interest in UFOs thereafter. And one of the things that's weird, Ryan, is that a few years ago, the Australian government did post its files on the Valentich case online, and a number of us downloaded those and read the file. I have a copy of them myself. And they describe Valentich as being kind of, depressed, dark, not a Friday night type, they quote Rhonda saying. And when I talked with her, I said, was he a depressed kind of person? Do you think that could have contributed to this? Could it have been a suicide? And she said, he wasn't really like that. And I've read those documents that you're talking about, and I know what they said that I said. And yeah, I might have said he wasn't exactly a Friday night type, but he wasn't depressed. He wasn't a loner, anything like that. She said we loved to go dancing. He was very, well-dressed, very, fashionable. He would come in. He was very friendly when he would come in and see her at work, and he would talk with people and things like that. She said that the strangest thing, though, had less to do with Freddie, and it had to do with an incident that occurred about a year after he vanished. She was in a department store where she worked at the time, and a gentleman comes up to her, and he says, I remember you. You're Rhonda Rushton. You were Freddie's girlfriend. And she didn't recognize him. Well, he was with the authority, and he had been one of the people who had helped with the interview of Rhonda Rushton. And he seemed to indicate to her that the recording that was released to Guido Valentich, his father, that there was, well, and this is what's funny, they described that recording as being an edited recording. The edited recording of the dialogue with air traffic control was released. And I'd always wondered, okay, what do they mean by edited, right?
Yeah, what didn't they hear, yeah.
And this conversation, right, where Rhonda's talking with this fella, he seems to indicate that after the metallic scraping noise, that after that portion of the audio that there may have been further dialogue, which is not on the transcripts and presumably not on the tape that was released. Now, so I asked, Now, I asked for clarification. I said, hold on, now, are you telling me that there's allegedly more to that recording? And she said that was the impression that I was given during this conversation. But nobody's been able to hear this. But we do know that what was released to the very few who have copies was described as an edited tape. Okay? That's weird. Another strange thing is that the Valentich family had written a book, apparently, about the case, which was stolen. And it was, again, the book that they wrote was just a manuscript that they had in their home, but somebody came into the home and stole the manuscript, stole that, and they never found out who. I asked Rhonda, did she have any idea who it might have been? And she said, well, in likelihood, that was probably, some journalist who wanted to be able to, have a scoop or something like that. So they didn't allege that there was some government conspiracy. But I did think that was kind of unusual, that the family's own personal account of life after Freddie disappeared was stolen from them and taken and never recovered.
Yeah.
And the other thing I asked her too is I said, listen, what do you think about him flying later? And she said, here's the thing. That was our 3-month anniversary. I was supposed to be on the plane with him. She said I was supposed to be flying with him that night, but I didn't get off work in time. Called my mom and dad, begged them to come get me. They had plans, so they couldn't come get me. We didn't have cell phones back then, so I couldn't call Freddie. The reason he seems to have left late was because he had been waiting on Rhonda. And imagine, had she been with him, she might have vanished too.
Mm-hmm.
The way that the circumstance worked out, Ryan, it's just so strange because, again, it was heartbreaking for her because he vanishes and they never find Freddie again, and Rhonda and the family just had to learn to cope with that. But she had initially been planning to be on that flight with him, and she said we were going to fly down and then come back, and we were going to go out to dinner. Which is funny because, again, one of the skeptical theories offered by Philip Glass had been that perhaps he had a girlfriend down there on King Island. Oh, yeah, well, I guess Rhonda was going to go meet the girlfriend, huh?
Yeah, right. Well, that also begs the whole question of, him planning some sort of suicide or disappearance, unless he was so depressed and angry that she didn't show up, that he just left without her. It sort of shows us that, he wasn't planning on making this trip alone, so... Yeah, it does bring up a lot of questions, for sure.
Yeah, I did ask her one other thing, too. I said, Rhonda, did you ever fly with him before that? She said, oh, yeah. I said, how many times? And she said, probably 30.
Wow.
And I said, yeah. I said, can I ask you a question? When you were with him in the plane, had he ever done any kind of stunt flying, anything like that? She said, look, I know what you're wondering about. Were we ever upside down? Because one of those theories had been that he'd been flying upside down. I didn't realize he was upside down and crashed into the ocean, and that the light he saw and mistook for a UFO was the light of the cockpit of his own aircraft, the light of the cockpit there reflecting off of the ocean below him. She said he did loop-de-loops and zero Gs and all these other kind of things. She described a variety of different things that Valentich likes to do when he would fly. And she said, so yeah, I'd been in the plane with him before when we had flown upside down. Trust me, when you're upside down. And she said specifically that in that kind of an aircraft that the radio, the mic would be dangling upside down if he'd been flying. So, the impression I got from her is that, first of all, she was never interviewed by any of these skeptics, and that she has just as many questions as the rest of us. But really, what can we say? He described seeing something strange. She went missing. He and his plane were never found. That's all we could really say about that case. But to try and make all these, again, what I think are absurd speculative theories about the girlfriend or the suicide attempt or all these strange things that he might have been secretly planning, and they never once, the skeptical thinkers who have proposed these theories, they never once went and interviewed Rhonda themselves. And what happens to me, of course, is somebody hears portions of the interview that I did with Rhonda, and they said, Micah, you've gotten too close to this case. You've allowed yourself to get too close to the case because you became friends with one of the witnesses. I said, she is a friend now. But when I interviewed her, I was looking for answers, and I don't think that actually doing what nobody else did and asking her about certain details of that case, I don't think that undermines the integrity of the research. It, if anything, adds to it in ways that people like Philip Glass, they didn't bother to. They just made stuff up.
While it's unlikely that the Valentich case will ever officially be reopened or even investigated in the near future, many researchers of UFOs and strange unsolved events remain fascinated with the incident. Indeed, it is only through further investigation and examination of the case that we can hope to get to the truth of what happened that October evening in 1978. In a rare interview with Guido Valentich, Fred's father, he would state the following about his son.
That night, he never turned up. He didn't ring up. Normally, it's always when he go for a trip, when he return at the airport, he normally would have called us, I'll be home after an hour or so. But that night, it was quite strange, We didn't know anything about it. We got home about 11 o'clock and he wasn't home. My wife then started to worry about it. And so, I said, this is too late to start inquiry. It was 8 o'clock, 8:30 in the morning. Nothing still happened and couldn't see any sign of him. And I was just about to get up and maybe get on the phone, where all of a sudden a couple of uniform blue legged walk in the front door. And at that time we realized immediately that something was wrong. After Frederick reported this UFO incident, I inclined to think that it could be some intelligent life in the outer space, despite all the officials are trying to suppress this. Really makes me very confused, because knowing Frederick, what he radiated, and knowing my son wouldn't make himself so ridiculous in stating things like that. So I'm inclined to believe that really must be something in the space that the general population may not aware to be. And I realized after his disappearance, which I couldn't have the opportunity before, how many calls I get from various parts of the world. And they really encouraged me to believe that he could be still alive.
The story of Zigmund Adamski is one of the most perplexing mysteries in modern UFO history. Adamski was a 56-year-old miner living in Tingley, near Wakerfield, West Yorkshire, in England. Described as a devoted husband and a quiet, hard-working man, he lived a seemingly ordinary life. However, this ordinary existence came to a shocking and inexplicable end on June 6, 1980. On this day, Adamski left his home to run errands, specifically to buy groceries. He had no reason to anticipate trouble or danger. However, Adamski never returned home. His sudden disappearance prompted his wife and friends to alert the authorities, but no trace of Adamski was found for over 5 days. His family and community were left bewildered, questioning how a man could just go out for groceries and just disappear in broad daylight and never return home. But on June 11th, 1980, Adamski's body was discovered in a coal yard in Todmorden, about 20 miles from his home. Trevor Parker, the owner of the coal yard, stumbled upon the corpse atop a 10-foot-high pile of coal. The location was strange in itself, as there was no clear way Adamski could have climbed or been placed there without significant effort, or equipment for that matter. And there were no signs of disturbance in the coal or the surrounding area, further complicating the mystery. And Adamski's body was in an unusual condition. He was wearing only a suit, with his shirt, watch, and wallet missing. His clothes appeared disheveled but not dirty, which was odd given the environment where he was found. Even stranger, his hair had been crudely cropped, as though it had been hastily cut by someone unfamiliar with how to do so. This detail raised questions about who had been in contact with him during the disappearance. But the most perplexing discovery was a series of unexplained burn marks on his neck, shoulders, and head. These burns appeared to be recent and had been treated with a green ointment that forensic scientists could not identify. Despite their best efforts, the substance remained a mystery. Detective Alan Godfrey of the West Yorkshire Police led an investigation into Adamski's death. Godfrey was a respected officer known for his professionalism, but this case would challenge even his seasoned investigative skills. The initial autopsy determined that Adamski had died of a heart attack, likely caused by the stress of the burns or the condition in which he had been held. However, the timeline surrounding his death raised more questions than it answered. Forensic analysis suggested that Adamski had died between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. on the day his body was discovered, but his appearance and injuries implied that he had been in someone else's custody during the 5 days he was missing. Investigators could not determine where Adamski had been or how he ended up on the coal pile. No witnesses reported seeing anything unusual in the coal yard, and there was no evidence of vehicles or individuals transporting the body to the location. Moreover, the burns on his body did not match any known chemical or environmental exposure, adding even more intrigue to the case. But that intrigue didn't end there, because this case took an unexpected turn when Detective Godfrey himself became involved in a UFO incident later that year. In November 1980, while investigating a separate case in Todmorden, Godfrey reported seeing a large diamond-shaped UFO hovering over a road.
Well, it was about 20 feet high, about 14 feet wide. It was a diamond-shaped object, hovering about 5 feet off the ground.
Now, at this point, you didn't see anybody, did you?
No, I didn't see anything other than that.
Did you approach it?
I got within about 20 feet of it.
And then you went back to your car to report it, did you?
No, I didn't get out of the car.
Ah.
I didn't want to get out of the car.
You didn't?
No.
But you got on the blower, did you?
I got on the radio, both radios, the VHF in the car and the UHF, personal radio that we carry.
Yeah.
And I got no response at all.
They didn't work?
No.
Was that unusual?
Not in that particular area. There are black spots in the area. The radios have worked there since.
And then you left the scene, did you?
The next thing I remember was I was at the other side of where the object had been, driving the car.
Away?
Away.
Did you report it when you got back?
I certainly did.
They thought you were crackers, presumably.
Yeah, they did.
Godfrey had claimed to have experienced a period of missing time during the encounter, which he later explored through hypnotic regression.
Well, under hypnosis, when I see the craft itself, as I said before, I didn't get out of the car consciously. I find myself getting out of the car, and for some reason, I have no idea why, a strange, very powerful beam of light is shone towards me, which blinds me. I jump back in the car in panic, and then there is some sort of a blackout. After the blackout, I wake up in some sort of an examination room.
I see. So this spaceship, or whatever it is, did you see that in your recollected...
Yes, everything under hypnotic regression, everything was accurate right up to...
The bit that...
when I got out of the car, yes.
Okay, well, describe this creature to me, this man.
Well, he was a humanoid, or of human appearance. He's about 6 feet high.
But not quite a human being, you said.
Well, he had a human appearance.
Yeah.
He had a beard, and he wore some sort of a skull cap, and he wore like a white gown. He was very pleasant in appearance. He wasn't at all frightening to look at.
Okay, now you got yourself into this room. What goes on there? Who else is there?
There were, I think I said there was 8 small, 3-foot-high creatures that transpilated during the hypnotic regression as robots.
Were you in a normal room, or were you in a spaceship, rather like Doctor Who's time capsule? Were you in something as kind of...
It looked bigger than his capsule.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't look very big, does it? Really? But inside it, yes, I would say it's very similar.
And then they tried to undress you, didn't they, at one point? Take your shoes and socks off. Why was that?
Well, this is one of the funny things about it. When I got back to the station, I found that my left boot was split, and I had a burn mark on the instep of my left foot. And in the hypnotic regression, they actually examined my left foot. Now, that's remarkable to me. with the other evidence of the other police officers seeing the craft as well.
How did your experience end in this place you were with these people?
The doctor woke me up. We never actually got to an ending. I was wired up to some heart machines, and they completely went off the scale. I was in such stress that both doctors stopped the hypnotic regressions.
Now tell me, what do you make of it all? Do you believe now in UFOs, or what? Are you convinced that those things actually happen to you, or it's just in your mind somewhere as an imagination or a dream or something like that?
Well, the UFO certainly existed.
You're sure of that?
Yes, it was a nuts and bolts craft. I think I'm quite capable of seeing something from 20 feet.
If I said to you anything you say we take down and use in evidence, you would say that you saw that thing?
Yes, I would swear on the Holy Bible. What I saw that day, I've seen nothing of the like, except in science fiction films.
And what other thoughts have you had about the whole experience?
The abduction part, well, I've thought about it. I've thought, well, perhaps it's something that I've read about and seen as Doctor Who, and because of my experience, it somehow got jumbled up. Yeah. Or it actually happened.
This experience caused some to speculate that there might be an actual connection between Adamski's death and extraterrestrial activity. Advocates of this theory pointed to the strange burns, the unidentified ointment, and the inexplicable circumstances of his disappearance and reappearance as evidence of a potential alien abduction. While the UFO hypothesis was dismissed by many as fanciful, it did resonate with others, particularly those in the UFO research community. Some theorized that Adamski might have been taken by aliens, subjected to experiments, and returned to Earth in a disoriented and deceased state. The green ointment and the burns were interpreted as potential signs of alien medical intervention. Skeptics of the UFO theory have proposed alternative explanations for Adamski's death. Some believe he may have been abducted or attacked by humans, possibly as part of a criminal act or a personal vendetta. However, there was no evidence to suggest Adamski had any enemies or was involved in any disputes of any kind. Others have suggested that Adamski might have suffered from a medical or psychological crisis, leading him to wander away from home and inadvertently find himself in a dangerous situation. However, this theory struggles to account for the burns, the missing days, or how his body ended up on the top of that coal pile. Another possibility is that Adamski's death was the result of some sort of clandestine experiment or a mishandled medical procedure. The green ointment, in particular, had been cited as evidence that someone attempted to treat his burns. However, no known medical facilities or practitioners came forward to claim any involvement in the case. More than 4 decades later, the death of Zigmund Adamski remains unsolved. Despite numerous investigations and theories, no definitive explanation has been found for the bizarre circumstances surrounding his disappearance and death. Adamski's death has also left a lasting impact on the small town of Todmorden, where it is still a subject of local lore. Detective Alan Godfrey, who eventually retired from the police force, continued to explore his own UFO encounter and its possible connections to the Adamski case. It was supposed to be a great day for Manuel Pereira de Cruz and Miguel Jose Viana. They had planned something secret and were quite enthusiastic about what might be found. So, on August 17th, 1966, they left their hometown of Campos dos Goitacazes. They told their families that they would buy some electronic materials for their jobs as electronic technicians. Manuel and Miguel then boarded a bus and arrived in Niterói at 2:30 p.m. They stopped by a shop and bought coats and bottles of drinking water. Later, the waiter at the shop said that Miguel looked very nervous and kept looking at his watch. Whatever the two of them were planning, it seemed like they were in a big rush. From the shop, the two men immediately continued their journey to Morro do Vitim, or Vitim Hill, in Rio de Janeiro. 3 days later, on August 20th, an 18-year-old teenager named Jorge was flying a kite on the hill when he witnessed a strange sight. In one part of the hill, Jorge saw two bodies lying on the ground, bushes and tall grass surrounding them. When he approached the bodies, he noticed they both wore similar outfits. Each also wore a kind of protective coat. But perhaps the most interesting aspect was that they both wore eyeglasses made mostly of lead. Jorge approached and realized that the two figures were lifeless. In a hurry, he got off the hill and contacted the police. Soon after, the site was filled with journalists and police officers. And this was just the beginning of a puzzling mystery. Police immediately conducted a search at the location where the bodies were found and collected all the objects that could be considered evidence. However, every clue found made this case even more mysterious. There did not appear to be any signs of violence or physical injury that could have killed them. This was confirmed by the fact that the tall grass near the bodies was not damaged, which indicated that the two did not experience any struggle or fighting in this location. As for the internal body, the officers could not draw any conclusions because both victims' organs had decomposed due to the late autopsy process. This condition made the toxins test impossible, and it was now also impossible to know for sure whether there was a poisonous substance that the two of them could have consumed. Another thing that adds to the mystery was the objects found on the men. Both were wearing lead masks covering their eyes. According to the victims' families, the two masks were indeed made by Manuel and Miguel in their workshop and intended to protect them from radiation. But no one knew what radiation they could have been protecting themselves from. Apart from the lead masks, several other objects were found. Among them was a notebook containing a diagram with a line in Portuguese that, when translated into English, read the following: 1630, be at the specified location. 1830, ingest capsules. After the effect protects metals, await signal mask. Investigators were unable to decipher the meaning of this message. These notes were confusing because they were written with multiple spelling and grammatical errors, and frankly, just made no sense. Also found was an empty water bottle bought from the shop, and a package containing 2 towels. From the available evidence, the police were trying to come up with a narrative that might reveal the cause of the deaths. Due to the unusual situation, many people began to theorize about what had happened, but the police had their own theories as well. And to say that all of these theories varied would be an understatement. Here were just a few of those theories. One theory that had been put forward was that the two men had committed suicide in some sort of cult-like pact. However, this theory was flawed for the mere fact that they had stopped to buy coats and drinking water. And when doing so, they had signed an invoice requiring them to return the bottles for a discount. So they clearly planned on returning for their deposit. They also had purchased several electronics to be used for their work. Why would they have bothered purchasing these items if they planned on committing suicide? Another theory suggests that the two men may have been lured to the premises by a third party who wanted to rob them. And when there, both were killed by this person. This conclusion was drawn because of the discovery of the notes that had all the errors and grammatical problems. It could be that the robber dictated this note to create a suicidal impression. After all, some of the money they brought to the hill was missing. But again, if their deaths were a result of some sort of robbery, why were there no signs of struggle or resistance found? The next most popular theory was that Manuel and Miguel attempted to make contact with aliens and succeeded. These two men were known to be avid UFO enthusiasts. They researched and investigated UFO sightings and encounters extensively, even building a small lab where they could test any evidence left behind from UFOs, or to analyze photos and videos. In addition, Vintem Hill was said to be the site of frequent UFO visits. Residents around the hill often witnessed strange objects hovering nearby. It would even come to light by several UFO researchers that there were sightings of strange objects in the area between the days that Manuel and Miguel went up to the hill and when their bodies were found. When one UFO investigator heard about these UFO sightings, he traveled to Niterói to inspect the scene. And that was none other than Jacques Vallée. Although his inspection of the area wouldn't be until 1980, he still wanted to attempt an investigation of this highly bizarre cold case. In the prologue of his book, Confrontations, he reported that grass and other plants refused to grow, even then in the spot where the bodies were found. And people he had interviewed reported that while the bodies had decayed somewhat by the time they were found, there was no unpleasant smell, and they had not been scavenged by local animals who seemed to give them a sort of wide berth. Perhaps most importantly, Vallée reports on the testimony of one Gracinda Barbosa Coutinho de Souza. She had reported the following to the police.
I was driving along Alameda São Boaventura in Fonseca with 3 of my children on Wednesday evening, the 17th. My 7-year-old daughter, Denise, told me to look up in the sky over the Morro do Vintem. That's when I noticed an oval object, orange in color, with a line of fire around its edges. It was sending out these rays in all directions as it hovered over the hill. I stopped the car to observe. This object rose and fell vertically for 3 or 4 minutes. The ray was blue and well-defined.
It was considered somewhat uncouth to discuss UFOs in Brazil at the time. But after this well-regarded woman was willing to put her name to such testimony, further reports started coming in. Apparently, she was not the only person who had seen an oval-shaped, orange-colored object emitting blue rays in the area. This was confirmed by a large number of witnesses, and all of them agreed on the time, which appeared to coincide closely with the deaths of Miguel and Manuel. In fact, these hills were a common place to witness unexplained lights and similar bizarre phenomena. When one witness, who remained anonymous, was questioned as to why they hadn't come forward with this information, they responded in saying that they assumed that these objects were extraterrestrial, and they did not want to be any part of that, due to their religious beliefs. When police began asking questions after the grisly find, they found that Miguel and Manuel's lives were highly influenced by a particularly technological and scientific strain of what was then called spiritualism, something we might today call New Age science or even UFO occultism. Their first tip came from an examination of Miguel and Manuel's workshop lab. Amid electronics gear and scraps of lead, apparently the same initial material from which the masks had been fashioned, they found extensive notes on spiritualism, along with a book by Bezarra de Menezes on scientific spiritualism. According to the Flying Saucer Review, the preeminent UFO periodical at the time, which published a series of 3 articles on the subject, the book had, quote, passages marked regarding masks, intense luminosity, and spirits, end quote. As it turns out, the police, quite to their surprise, soon learned that practically everybody involved in the high-level electronics trade in Brazil also had something to do with scientific spiritualism, a hobby that revolved around revelations from beings in higher planes of reality, telepathic communication with disembodied ET entities, seances, hallucinogenic drug use, and other decidedly unscientific endeavors. Elsewhere in the world, other scientists were drilling holes in their heads, so no judgment here. This and weirder things were related when police questioned Elcio Gomes, an erstwhile assistant to Miguel and Manuel. His testimony further revealed that the scientific in scientific spiritualism wasn't mere lip service. There was plenty of the weirdo tech-savvy classical UFO hunter in Miguel and Manuel. They may have expected to contact aliens through telepathy and seances, but they also expected them to come in classic physical UFOs. And once they got those UFOs to Earth, they were apparently preparing to deal with them in the only way they saw fit from a possible threat to all of humanity: explosives. Gomes would also state that Miguel and Manuel were hopeful of entering into communication with beings on Mars, that they collaborated in many strange electronic experiments, and that they and Gomes had engaged in an experiment in Manuel's garden, when a device that they had built had exploded violently. Once word got around that Gomes had broken his secrecy regarding these experiments, the local residents opened up again, much as they had after Miss De Souza's revelations regarding the orange UFO on the night in question. The explosion in Manuel's garden had apparently been massive, shaking walls and causing a huge ruckus. Yet it paled to another experiment that the trio had engaged in at the Atafona beach. The details, again, had fallen by the wayside. Suffice to say, the three had been spotted on the beach on June 12th, setting up some kind of apparatus, after which an intensely luminous object came down over the shore. According to the Flying Saucer Review, quote, 5 minutes later, when it began to rise, there was a blinding flash and an explosion which rocked the city of Campos and buildings far beyond. When inquiries were made, local fishermen testified that they had seen a flying saucer fall into the sea. After this, we at Flying Saucer Review begin to read in the reports that the Brazilian Naval and Air Force intelligence services were taking an interest in both the deaths and the explosions. In the very last report we have on this case, there was a story that the Navy's monitoring service had intercepted a strange conversation over the air between 3 radio hams on the evening of June 12th. The station prefixes were CKJ-22 and CK-22, who were talking to CKJ-21. Details of the conversation were not disclosed, but investigations had shown that no such prefixes existed in the register of amateur radio transmitting stations in Brazil. End quote. It was rapidly becoming obvious to police that Miguel and Manuel were more than a little off. At the very least, things certainly tended to explode a whole lot when they were around. The police investigation, however, still failed to produce any kind of explanation as to how or why they had died. A certain imprisoned gangster named Hamilton Bizzani even came forward and offered a confession at one point, claiming that he and some others had contacted Miguel and Manuel, offering to sell them some kind of radioactive material. Hamilton had given them capsules to supposedly protect them against radiation, and had told them to retrieve the goods from the hilltop, a common spot for conducting illicit transactions. And these capsules were in fact poison. All Hamilton had to do was wait, then go up to the hill and retrieve the cash that the pair had on them to purchase the materials. Police jumped at the opportunity to get this case laid to rest, but they soon pegged Hamilton's confession for a con, speculating that he was trying to get transferred to a prison in Niterói, which was apparently known as being easy to escape from. Hamilton's story just didn't hold up, as he was not able to relate key details he should have known, and he couldn't identify any of his co-conspirators, except in extremely vague terms. And his story also failed to explain the lead masks, and he couldn't produce the money. There's a good reason for that last fact. When Jacques Vallée visited Niteroi, he took the apparently unprecedented next step of asking Miguel's family about this supposed missing cash. He was told that while the duo had indeed left Campos with a backstory about buying a used car, his family had quickly found that he'd actually taken very little money with him. The car, the electronics purchases, all of it was a smokescreen. This is further confirmed by Miguel's widow, who told Vallée that as Miguel was leaving, he quietly leveled with her. He was taking a trip to Niteroi in order to perform some kind of experiment on the hill. With a cousin, he was more candid. Quote, "Buying a car isn't the real purpose of this trip," he would tell his cousin. Quote, "When I get back, I'll tell you whether or not I believe in spiritualism." End quote. Miguel and Manuel had a rendezvous with something up on that hill. Maybe it was an ET and a UFO that had stopped their hearts. Maybe it was some kind of disembodied intellect that had overwhelmed their brains. Maybe it was a drug overdose that dispatched them in a more straightforward manner. Maybe they expected to die. Maybe they thought it was a possibility, or maybe it took them completely by surprise. But whatever happened, it wasn't just random happenstance. It was something they were prepared for. Something that would either be life-changing or life-ending. What that something was, we may never truly know. And the mystery of the lead-masked ufologists remains unexplained. Upon visiting the site of Viana and Cruz's death as part of his research, Jacques Vallée was bombarded with other strange stories and tales from the region, some dating back 2 decades prior. In 1946, Prestes Filho was returning to his village of Araca Riguama at a little after 7 p.m. from a fishing trip when a strange object appeared overhead, shooting out a strange beam of light as it did so. The light hit Filho, who barely managed to get to his front door and inform his sister of what had happened. Within hours, his condition had worsened dramatically. Vallée would write that he had learned from the reports that the man's flesh had literally detached itself from the bone, as if he'd been boiled in hot water for a long time, so that his skin and underlying tissue had fallen off. By the time Filho had reached the local hospital, it was too late, and he had tragically died. No explanation was ever given. Another gruesome account took place just after 7 p.m. on July 4th, 1969, when 2 children saw a strange bright object land in a nearby field on a local farm. One of the main witnesses, Mauricio Neco, had arrived at the farm with his Aunt Rosa, whose cousin was the owner. There were several other children who were also a part of the family and had arrived to spend several nights at the farm. One evening during the stay, Mauricio, along with his 3 cousins, Andres, Marina, and Enrique, had ventured onto a hill to look at the stars overhead. It was as they were doing so that they noticed a strange light, different from the stars, appear overhead. The children remained where they were and watched the light as it moved. As they did so, they could clearly see that it was growing steadily larger, as if it was approaching. Bizarrely, though, they noted between themselves that no sound could be heard, even as the object continued its approach. As Mauricio continued to watch, the other children began calling to the other family members to come and see the unnerving light. Grabbing their torches, they began to flash and signal in its direction. The object responded and came rapidly closer to them. The rest of the family, the 3 adults and the 6 younger children, now alerted by the children's terrified screams, came out to witness a bright craft. In all, there were 13 family members who saw the object overhead. They would describe it as approximately the size of a car and a sphere-like shape. Furthermore, it glowed particularly bright amber and lit up the entire surrounding area. Then, it began to move back toward the main house over the field of blackberry crops. Euricio Bermudez, one of the uncles, snatched a torch out of his child's hand and made off into the direction of the brightly lit craft. He quickly disappeared into the blackberry crops that lined the field. The children soon followed, a little less eager than Euricio. As they did, they could hear the general distress of the cattle and chickens, as well as the apparent agitation of the family dog. They suddenly arrived at one of the outbuildings behind the main house. There, in front of them, was Euricio, and across from him was the glowing craft, hovering only ever so slightly above the ground. They watched for several minutes as Euricio and the strange object remained opposite to each other, as if in some sort of bizarre standoff. Then, it rose into the air and suddenly took off at breakneck speeds. Soon after, the entire family all returned home, and although they would turn into bed, no one in the house slept at all that evening. The next day, the children were to return to their respective homes following the stay. Before doing so, they went to find their Uncle Euricio to thank him and bid him farewell. However, he had remained in bed due to waking up feeling very, very sick. Then, 3 days later, things took an even more dramatic turn. Maurizio's mother received a call from his aunt. She needed him to come back to the farm and take Euricio to the hospital. In the coming days, Euricio became increasingly ill. Dark blue spots had appeared on his skin, and he had a constant feeling of nausea. And several days later, a week after the sighting to be exact, Euricio would be dead. The official explanation for his death was put down to gastroenteritis. The doctor in charge of the case, however, did note that he could not explain Euriccio's very low body temperature. In fact, according to some reports, Euricio was so cold that nurses were not able to take blood samples due to crystallization having occurred. Perhaps even stranger is the account from Maurizio's mother, who claimed that on the way to the hospital, Euricio leaned into her for a moment. Not only could she feel how disturbingly cold he was, but that cold feeling remained on her side of the body until he passed away 3 days later. But this truly bizarre and tragic case does not end here. Here we have to note, as highlighted by UFO researcher Scott Corrales, that far from being a strange case that no one has heard of, the incident did draw national attention for a brief period in 1969, with several publications running stories and reports on it. In fact, one of the leading UFO organizations at the time, APRO, would send several field investigators to examine the incident. It was their general opinion that Euricio had been exposed to large amounts of radiation due to his close proximity to a UFO. They would seek permission from the family to have his body exhumed in order to perform tests. However, the family would, incidentally, refuse. But several years later, when an agreement was struck to exhume the body, the situation turned even more disturbing. Upon opening the coffin, all present would discover that the body was gone. There has never been a satisfactory explanation as to what had happened to it, or who might have taken it. Was it perhaps the military who swooped in and took the body, doing their own tests to figure out what had happened to this person? Or was it taken by extraterrestrials? The family of Maurizio would hear a very interesting story themselves in the local community. According to what they were told, several strange men had offered a substantial amount of money to one of the gravediggers of the churchyard where Maurizio was buried, in return for allowing them to dig up and remove the body. Who these men were, however, is not known. The tragic case of Maurizio Bermudez is one that still frustrates UFO investigators and enthusiasts around the world. The main witness to the incident, Maurizio, has maintained an interest in the events of that July evening, events that he would describe as life-altering. Our final tragic case propels us forward to the year 2002, when another highly mysterious death had possible connections to a UFO encounter. Most of the research for this case has been carried out by independent researcher Lon Strickler and former homicide detective, the late Butch Witkowski. It was around 5 a.m. on August 4th, 2002, when 39-year-old Todd Sees left his home in Montour Ridge in Northumberland County, Pennsylvania. He planned to scout deer, something he had done many times previously, with his family expecting him home around noon. He would set out on his Ford WD truck, perfect for the rough terrain where he was headed. However, when noon came and went without his return, his family became immediately concerned. They would soon notify local police of his disappearance, and a search operation was put into action. This involved local police and state police, search and rescue personnel, as well as around 200 volunteers. Furthermore, highly trained sniffer dogs and helicopter units would take part in the search efforts. The entire area was searched, including the family property itself and the woodlands adjacent to it. Also searched was a pond that was around 70 feet from the family home. In fact, because of the small body of water and its close proximity to the house, this particular area was searched extremely thoroughly. No sign of Todd Sees was discovered. However, his truck was found, and it was found around 2 miles from his home at a ridge, where he had stated he would be that morning. Around 36 hours into the search, just by pure chance, something in the brush near the aforementioned pond caught the attention of one of the searchers. They would go to investigate further and make a grim discovery. Here is former homicide detective Butch Witkowski explaining his end of the investigation and what happened next.
Todd Sees, a 39-year-old white male, lived at the base of Montour Ridge in Northumberland County. Married, father of two boys. Got dressed one morning early and jumped on his ATV and decided he was going to take a ride up to Montour Ridge to spot early season deer. Told his wife he would be back by noon. Noon came and went. 2 o'clock, his wife notified the police department. Search team was organized immediately. They found his four-wheeler at the top of the ridge. They had cadaver dogs and search dogs, state police, approximately 200 volunteers altogether. They had divers go into the pond on his property, dive the pond, search the bottom of the pond. Pond is located about 25 yards from the house. The only thing they did find was one of Todd Sees' shoes, about 78 feet in the air in a tree. Police questioned, of course, people in the area, and it's kind of a rural farming community, so it's like, a couple living places where people really have real homes, and there's like 6 farms and a home. Some farmers at a farm 2 miles away from the residence said that they saw what they believed to be a tube-shaped object above the tree line and power line, and a beam projecting down from it, and something being lifted up into the craft. They couldn't describe what it was. The search continued throughout the day. They searched 6 square miles of Montour Ridge. All they found was the ATV and Mr. Sees' one boot in the tree. They called it a night, started all over the next morning, and later on in the afternoon, in a thicket of bushes 25 yards away from the house at the pond, somebody sees something white. Now, these people have been marching past this site for almost 2 days, 30-some hours. Nobody has seen anything in that area. But at this time, they see something white. Firemen, of course, start digging into it. It's a very heavy brush. They've got to cut into it with axes and power tools. And they finally find Todd Sees. Todd Sees is in his underwear. He is pale white. He is emaciated. Remember, this takes place in August. Had he been out there for the time of death, which the coroner ruled at 36 hours, he would have been bloated beyond belief. There was no livor mortis, no rigor mortis on the body, nothing but a few scratches from the bramble bushes in which he was entangled. 3 feet away from his body was that of a dead rattlesnake, same time of death. Mr. Sees was not bitten by the rattlesnake. The body was described by people at the scene as his hands were up like this, and he had a look of horror on his face. He also had 1.5 inches or 1 centimeter burn mark on his left temple. The body was removed without a coroner on the scene. Pennsylvania law requires that if your head is laying over there and your body is laying over there, I, as a police officer, cannot pronounce you dead. I have to have a coroner. That is law. Nobody can pronounce you dead but a coroner. The body was removed to Fort Indian Town Gap. Nobody from the family was allowed to view the body, and nobody viewed the body before it was interred. Point Township has about a 6-man police department. Their statement after all this took place was that Todd Sees' information on how he died would be forthcoming in about 6 to 8 weeks, and that's when the people could have the body back, the family. Toxicology had to take place. They wanted to know what was in the blood, what happened. Was there any foul play, which they kind of ruled out. 7.5 weeks later, the toxicology results come back. Todd Sees died of a cocaine overdose. I've seen a lot of cocaine overdoses. Never seen one where the guy threw his shoe up in a tree and there were no footprints around his vehicle, like when he got off his vehicle to wherever he went. So with all that in mind, we tried a Freedom of Information Act report request from the police department. We were told it's still an open case. My question to the sergeant that day was, if it's still an open case, why did you say that he died of a cocaine overdose? Isn't that the cause of death? Yes, he replied. I said, if that's the cause of death, then the case is closed. No, it's not. And then he threatened to have me arrested for harassment. Do I think he died of a cocaine overdose? Nah, not even close. Cocaine overdose doesn't leave a burn mark on your temple. Cocaine overdose does not make you disappear for 36 to 40 hours. And I find it very hard to believe that 200 searchers with dogs and cadaver dogs walked past this body for 2 days and didn't see it. So, nah.
So what happened to Todd Sees? And what about the possible UFO connection? There were at least 2 UFO reports around the same time as the Todd Sees disappearance. And in each report, it would be claimed that there was a craft over Montour Ridge. Of even more concern, though, was the detail that a light beam had seemingly snared a human being and was moving it through the air and toward the object overhead. So, was Todd Sees the extremely unfortunate victim of alien abduction that, on this unfortunate occasion, turned deadly? If not, what was the reason for the apparent secrecy and closed nature of the authorities on the circumstances of the death? It is a fine line to tread for those in the UFO community who wish to examine this case. On the one hand, there is the very real death of a young man with a family. On the other hand, there is a whole host of unanswered questions and reasons for suspicion. Not to mention the claims of UFO sightings in the area on the day of the Todd Sees disappearance. No matter the case, it does remain unexplained. This is just a handful of mysterious and tragic cases of deadly UFO encounters. And it's cases like this that truly put into question whether the intelligences behind UFOs do in fact have less than benevolent or altruistic intentions. Were these merely fatal versions of wrong place at the wrong time? Or could they have been cases where an observer or experiencer was actually targeted? In either case, sometimes it takes peering into the dark corners to bring truth to light. And no matter the case, each of these people have family and friends. They had lives before these events, and they have legacies and those who remembered them long after the events as well. And while speculation can be alluring, we must never forget that above all else, these were tragedies that may have had something to do with the mysteries that lay somewhere in the skies. This episode was co-researched by Marcus Loth. To learn more, visit ufoinsight.com. Please take a moment to rate and review Somewhere in the Skies on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It truly does help us gain visibility and find new listeners. Thank you in advance. You can find all of our social media in the show notes or just search for Somewhere in the Skies. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, keep your feet on the ground, but never stop searching somewhere in the skies.